So you're going to check. Hey. How are you doing?
How are you doing?
Very well, thanks.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Yeah,
Did you are out?
I'm glad to see you here. Testing, 1, 2, 3, check. Okay.
I'll take that microphone. Well, we are going to get started here with this breakout session. My name is Walter Fast. I'm the lead pastor in Steinbach, an hour south of Winnipeg. For those of you who aren't familiar, I've been there for 16 years. And I am a past member of the National Faith and Life team, so they asked me if I would introduce, in this case, my brother today for this topic. So I've got to tell you a little story to go with this. My mother had us 8 children in 8 years. So picture the Fast family out in Vancouver, BC, where we grew up, day in, day out, sitting around a big oak table that my dad had custom made for this large family, discussing and maybe arguing at times about God and the world. And picture yourself, if you're a parent, you have a 12-year-old, my youngest sister, I'm the second youngest, and Ed, Fast is my oldest brother, he would have been 20. So you have 12 and 20 and 8 kids in the basically as teenagers, discussing with mom and dad everything that you can imagine. And those were very formative years for us. And it led each of us in very different directions as kids. And we brothers, Ed's my oldest brother, I'm the second youngest in the family. I became a pastor. Ed, after a lengthy career as a lawyer, went into civic politics as a trustee, and then acted as the MP for Abbotsford for the last 20 years. He just recently had his retirement party. So that's just by way of a little family introduction here. Glad that you're able to make it out here, Ed, to help us. The topic under discussion has obviously been a challenge for us as Christians, not to say Mennonites. Do we participate in worldly affairs, such as government or not? What are our reasons for or against? How consistent have we as Mennonites been? How can you be a Nehemiah or a Daniel when given the opportunity to actually be in a high position in government, as my brother has had the opportunity to do? Is it possible? What are the limits? Is there a price to be paid when engaging? So Ed has had to do a lot of thinking about these issues, and so look forward to having him speak to us, challenge us, and maybe we'll have the opportunity to challenge him back with a question or two as well. So the plan is to give him about 50 minutes to speak, and then the last 10 or 15 minutes, there will be an opportunity for you to ask your questions as well. So Ed, take it away.
Well, thank you, Walter, and it is a real privilege for me to be here at the Equip Conference. Usually I speak at secular, at political events. I speak at trade-related events, but to come here back to my Mennonite brethren family is a wonderful treat for me, and hopefully some of the words I share with you will impart some elements of wisdom and maybe new knowledge about the role that Christians can play in the public square. So it was the evening of January 23, 2006, and my wife, my family and I, along with friends and hangers-on and acquaintances, and of course the media, were all gathered together celebrating an election victory. It was my first federal election victory, and Stephen Harper had been elected as Prime Minister after 13 years of Liberal rule in Canada. And as we're celebrating, an elderly gentleman came up to me, and he very gently poked me in the chest. He said, "Mr. Fast, now that you've been elected as the MP for Abbotsford, I hope you're not going to Ottawa to shove religion down people's throats." Not surprisingly, I was taken aback. But as I reflected quickly, I thought, okay. I responded by saying to the gentleman, "Sir, I have no intention of doing what you've suggested, which is shoving religion down people's throats. But can you tell me, which of my faith values do you want me to leave behind? Is it love? Loving my neighbor as myself? What about forgiveness and compassion? What about grace and goodness and mercy?" And I think he got the point. And that useful confrontation, it wasn't really a confrontation. It was a gentleman that was very concerned that as a Christian, I was known in my community of Abbotsford as being a Christ follower and someone who had had already a fairly lengthy political life in our community. He was concerned I was going to Ottawa to push a religious dogma or doctrine down people's throats, which was, of course, not the case. That election night confrontation it basically put into sharp relief the tension that I would face during my time in public office. And yes, I did serve almost 20 years as a member of Parliament for Abbotsford, and I did recently retire. And now I'm a recovering politician. And so, as I reflect upon my lifetime spent at the intersection of faith and public life, I am very deeply grateful to my extended church family. That's you. That's my church family at home in Abbotsford at Northview. And I'm so grateful for their ongoing prayers and support and encouragement. You have no idea what an advantage I had in Abbotsford to have people regularly come to my office, to my MP office, say, "Mr. Fass, I just want to drop by. I'm not going to spend any time chatting with you. I just wanted to say, you need to know we are praying for you. We want to encourage you in the work that you're doing. We trust that God will give you the confidence and the wisdom to be able to govern wisely as you discharge your obligations as a member of Parliament. So that support has been essential as I navigated the rough and tumble world of politics in an era marked by uncertainty, by instability, by polarization, and cultural division. And we see that playing out across our country and around the world. Just look to the south, to the United States, the division and the polarization that is taking place there. And it's taking place in Canada as well. So the question of how faith should inform politics is as old as the scriptures themselves. Isaiah urged us to come, let us reason together, which is an invitation not only to forgiveness, but to dialogue. And Micah reminds us of what God truly requires of us, his followers. And by the way, this is the verse that sort of became a bit of a guiding light for me as I spent 20 years in our capital city in Ottawa. And that was to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. So in furtherance of that call, I do note that the MB Confession of Faith encourages us to, quote, cooperate with others in society to defend the weak, to care for the poor, and promote justice, righteousness, and truth. That's in Article 12. And those principles and faith values and the ideologies they inform, and that I went to Ottawa with, should guide us as citizens and as leaders wherever we've been placed. The truth is, social media and the interconnectedness of our globalized world has brought every possible ideology to our doorstep and to the doorstep of our children. The competition for the hearts of the next generation is fierce and will only be won for Christ as we, the people of the Word, live out our lives with such winsomeness and integrity that others will be drawn to Jesus through our life's testimony. So let me be clear, just so you know where my bias lies. I believe it is a mistake to single out the arena of politics as the one area of public life that is off limits to that essential witness. So some within our Mennonite community of faith have asked me, so did you go to Ottawa with the express mission of promoting peace or peacemaking within politics? Actually, the answer is no, not specifically so. Rather, my goal was to be faithful and a humble follower of Jesus, and for him to use me as he wished to help shape our nation, to do justice and love mercy. In practical terms, this meant engaging in what Richard Beck called the pragmatic pursuit of the common good. The pragmatic pursuit of the common good. If in that role God could use me to be a peacemaker, so much the better. But it was not the primary motivation as I entered that public arena. So, let me begin by painting the context for my comments about public life, my engagement in public life over the years. As many of you know, most Western governments are, by law and by convention, secular. Canada is a liberal democracy, like many others around the world, no longer anchors itself in the Judeo-Christian worldview that once shaped its founding principles. You go back to the founding fathers and you see the statements they make and the speeches they made in the House of Commons. They drew on our Judeo-Christian heritage to sustain the new democracy they had created in Canada. But that is no longer the case. Instead, we inhabit a post-Christian, pluralistic society where competing ideologies vie for dominance and where faith voices are often dismissed marginalized, and even mocked. And by the way, even in my political life, from time to time, I've been mocked by individuals that saw my Christian faith as being something archaic and inconsistent with a modern democracy. And yet, within this challenging context, I believe we are called to boldly speak wisdom into a fallen world, to speak truth to power, and to be the aroma of Christ, however God has gifted us and wherever God has placed us. The scriptures are rife with examples of such bold leaders. Joseph advised Pharaoh. Daniel counseled Babylonian and Persian kings. And Queen Esther risked her life in the court of Xerxes. I note Nehemiah was mentioned earlier. None of the rulers they served worshiped the God of Israel, yet all benefited from the wisdom and courage of his people. I believe these biblical figures modeled faithful engagement within imperfect, even hostile political and belief systems. And the Apostle Paul provides perhaps the most vivid New Testament example of this. You may recall in Athens, surrounded by idols and skeptics, he did not retreat. Instead, he boldly engaged the philosophers of the Areopagus on their own terms, quoting their poets, acknowledging their spiritual hunger, and then pointing them to the unknown God made known in Christ. Paul is a wonderful example of someone who didn't shrink from the challenges of engaging in an often hostile marketplace of ideas. In so doing, Paul demonstrated how Christ followers can confidently and unapologetically enter the public square, engaging with their culture respectfully and intelligently by building bridges of understanding without compromising truth. And as you know, in today's society, there's your truth, there's my truth. A lot of people don't want to accept the fact that there is absolute truth. And absolute truth for me as a Christ follower is found in God's Word. It is authoritative, certainly for my life, for the church. But how we share that with a fallen world is going to take great tact and, as I mentioned, winsomeness. So, how does a Christ follower within the public square maintain his or her integrity, especially within a highly partisan environment, especially within a highly partisan parliamentary system that we have in Canada? We have to understand politics in a democracy is above all a team sport, especially within a parliamentary democracy where you have parties that purport to represent the interests and the prevailing ideology or ideologies of their society. And of course, these ideologies are constantly in competition with each other. So typically within a parliamentary democracy, our public officials converge around a common set of issues and policies, leading to a level of policy coherence that allows political parties to be successful and govern. And I can tell you from experience, if there is not that coherence within a party structure, you're likely never going to get elected and have the opportunity to shape the future of your country. So this requires compromise, yes, compromise, party discipline, and a willingness to work within imperfect structures. Sadly, Canadian political life also too often resembles a blood sport, where ambition tramples principle, where marriages falter, even amongst Christians, by the way, and identity becomes inseparable from political position. And that is the challenge for many MPs, is over time they become defined by who they are as a member of Parliament. Someone with privilege, someone with authority, someone with power. and you lose sight, not only of your own humanity, but as a Christ follower, you lose sight of what your true mission is, which is to be salt and light and to walk humbly. That's one of the things I would mention, is that I find that amongst the political elite in Canada, the one thing that is missing above all others is humility, accepting the fact that we're all human, we're all prone to fail, we're all prone to make mistakes. And how often do you hear politicians actually say, you know what, I made a mistake there, but you know what, I'm going to do better. I'm going to surround myself with wise counsel to make sure that I get this right next time. Rarely happens in politics, which is very unfortunate. When I arrived in Ottawa, I quickly discovered an environment in which politicians were stepping all over each other to climb the greasy pole of ambition. And I think most of you know politics can be messy. It is messy. In fact, it can be very messy. But then I remind people, so were the government environments that Joseph and Daniel and Esther and Paul found themselves in. Those are messy environments, hostile, challenging to their own integrity, yet all of them lived out a life of integrity within that environment. The challenge for us as Christians, especially those who are called to serve in that kind of environment, is to maintain their integrity and godly character amid these pressures. And that is a challenging assignment. Well, what is our mission as those of us who are called to this public marketplace of ideas, where the battle of ideas and concepts and worldviews takes place? So is the mission power for its own sake? I think there are many that would say yes. And I will say that over my years as MP, I had the opportunity to serve as Stephen Harper's Minister of Trade for almost 5 years. And as you might expect, when the Prime Minister travels abroad, who does he bring with him? He's going to bring his Foreign Affairs Minister along. He's going to bring his International Development Minister along, probably maybe an Agriculture Minister, because many of our trade disputes involve agriculture. And of course, the Trade Minister gets to go along. So on most of Stephen Harper's trips abroad, I had the opportunity and the privilege to accompany him to go into meetings with people like Vladimir Putin and Barack Obama and Prime Minister Modi of India and Angela Merkel of Germany and China's President Xi. And along the way, I've been able to observe different leadership styles. And many of those leaders, I will tell you, are focused on the use of power, often to the exclusion of the welfare of the people they were supposed to serve. Now, there are examples of servant leaders. I'll get to that later. But you know, servant leadership is rarely seen in public life, where a leader puts the interests of others ahead of their own. And the other day, I was discussing this with a group of politicians and business people, government people, and I mentioned the term servant leadership. Like, for us as Christ followers, it makes absolute sense. It's baked into the scriptures. Hopefully it's baked into who we are as Christians. But I mentioned servant leadership, and someone piped up, "Can you tell me, what are you talking about, servant leadership?" I was taken aback, because I thought everybody would understand what that is. You know, the fallen world out there really doesn't get the concept of servant leadership. And so we have an opportunity as Christ followers to live that out in our daily lives, whether we're in leadership roles or otherwise. Now, none of you will be surprised that not every Christian politician has the same perspective on Micah's admonition to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. There are some that believe the role of Christian public leaders and their followers is to seize the tools of power to achieve spiritual ends. This trend is especially noticeable within evangelicals, especially to the south. And there are those that have embraced the NAR movement. And they posit that today's church leaders are expected to lead a worldwide revival by establishing God's kingdom here on earth through spiritual and societal transformation, using the political and other social tools available in our secular culture. Now, let me be very clear. Spiritual and societal transformation fully support that as one of our objectives as the church. But to believe that the tools of political power can be used almost exclusively to achieve those goals, I believe is wrong-headed. Confusing faith with political power, conflating democratic pluralism with genuine Christianity, and transforming the power of the Christian gospel into a tribal identity risks doing tremendous damage to the cause of Christ. As Chuck Colson wisely observed, the kingdom of God will not arrive on Air Force One. This reflected his belief that true change and redemption cannot be achieved through political power or government structures, but only through a personal transformation of the heart through the blood of Jesus. Seizing the tools of political power cannot change people's hearts. Only God can. But I do believe that the levers of government can, when used properly, create the conditions in which human dignity is protected and justice is pursued. And that calls for leaders of humility, grace, and forbearance who refuse to be defined by the power they wield. Power is a powerful aphrodisiac, and you'll see it all over when you go to Parliament Hill. People who are trying to climb that greasy pole of ambition that I mentioned. And yet at the end of the day, that is not what we've been called to do as Christ followers. Wherever God opens a door, a conversation where we can engage with people with the love of Jesus, that is our calling, to do so with humility and grace and forbearance. So, might I suggest that this is a call to faithful engagement and not withdrawal? Now, there are others who might argue that Christians should retreat from public life to build countercultural communities. We Mennonites have inherited a heritage which harkens back to relatively insular communities in Russia whose inhabitants were known as die stillen Lande, or the quiet ones in the land. Those Mennonites tried to live under the radar of government, so to speak, and to allow their piety to speak for itself. And to be sure, there is great wisdom in strengthening families and institutions of faith and resisting the enticements of secular society. Yet retreat cannot be the only answer. Now, many of you will know Alyssa Childers, the daughter of singer Chuck Girard, and now a Christian apologist. She suggested that, quote, if we truly love others, part of that love must include advocating for the well-being of the societies in which they live. Christians who live in a country where they have the ability to shape the governing structure, where laws can be made and enforced to promote what is truly good and restrain what is truly evil, they should absolutely take part in that process, end quote. Christians living in free democracies like ours are the beneficiaries of both a gift, a beautiful gift, and a responsibility. Democracy and the right to elect those who would lead us is not the norm in most of the world. It is our gift to treasure and to nurture. Withdrawing from public life and from the marketplace of ideas squanders that gift, at least in my view. And it would be an abdication of our commitment to love our neighbors. Loving our neighbors in that way and engaging in the marketplace of ideas is a demonstration of what it means to be a Christ follower and a servant leader. As I mentioned, public engagement does not mean seizing the levers of power to impose a religious belief or secure spiritual outcomes, like that elderly gentleman that poked me in the chest and was worried I was going to shove religion down people's throats. We have more to offer than simply a religion. We have a relationship with the living God that we want people to know about. And how will people know that? By seeing our faith values manifested in our daily lives. So democracy and the right to elect those who would lead us is not the norm. It is our gift to treasure and to nurture, and withdrawing from public life and from the marketplace of ideas squanders that gift. As I mentioned, the public engagement is not about seizing the levers of power. What it does mean, entering the public square with humility, with integrity, and the courage and confidence to A, speak the truth, B, share our faith values, and when prompted by the Holy Spirit, sharing the gospel with our community and its members, even when it might be unpopular to do so. So, can a Christian and a Christian politician make a difference? What I thought I'd do, I'd close my remarks by sharing a bit of my own story. How God inspired me and led me to a life of politics. And I'm going to add something additional, and that is just a very quick discussion of why mentorship of the next generation of leader is so critically important for all of us to embrace. So I began with my story in 2006 when I was elected to Parliament, but my actual political story started way before that. It was 1964, November to be exact. I was 9 years old. It was a school night. And my father sat me down in front of a black and white television set with the rabbit ears. Virtually no one here remembers those, but I do. I'm old enough to remember that. Grainy black and white television set. And he said, "Ed, tonight you can stay up a little bit later. I want to explain something to you." And what he did, he started to explain what was happening on television, which was that the election returns, the presidential election returns from the United States were being discussed on television live in black and white. The two candidates were President Johnson, who had succeeded the assassinated JFK. His opponent was a Republican by the name of Goldwater. And he explained to me who these two individuals were, what the President of the United States was, what politics was, what government was, the fact that the decision that Americans were making that night would shape the future course of their country's history. So my father's explaining this to me. He obviously dumbed it down to a 9-year-old level. But that seed of interest that my father planted that evening, I believe, started to grow and germinate and grow in my life. And as I went through high school, I was the one within my group of friends that would drag my friends to election night rallies. I'd be the one reading the newspaper, catching up on the latest political events. And as I went through university, I always thought, you know, it would be nice to be sort of like my member of Parliament, whose name was John Fraser. John Fraser was a fisheries minister under Brian Mulroney, and later on became Canada's longest-serving Speaker of the House of Commons. John Fraser was my MP in South Vancouver. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to be like John Fraser and be in Ottawa, our capital city, helping to shape the future of our country? But I graduated from law school at UBC, and my wife and I moved out to Abbotsford, and very quickly I had 4 daughters. And I can tell you that political life in Ottawa is very hard on families. understand that Ottawa or Parliament Hill is the marriage graveyard of Canada. And by the way, Christians aren't immune. And I made the decision, no, I'm not going to go into federal politics. It would just be too costly from a family standpoint. But there's this beautiful thing called local politics, city council, school board, where you're at home at night, but you still are involved in the life of the community, helping to shape the future of the community. And that's what I did. I was able to serve as school trustee, later on moved on to city council, served as deputy mayor. And it was a wonderful opportunity to serve and still be there for my 4 daughters as they grew up. But the time came when Randy White, who was our MP at the time, announced that he was retiring. And in 2005, I made the decision to step into the federal arena. I won the Conservative nomination in Abbotsford and then won the subsequent election. January 23rd of 2006, I was elected as the Member of Parliament. So the question is, can an MP actually make a difference, especially a Christ follower? Might I suggest we can? I did get a chance to shape our country. I had the opportunity to introduce a private member's bill called C-277, which was intended to double the maximum prison sentence for those luring children over the internet, out of their homes, for sexual purposes. It was the luring law, and ironically, the penalty for rustling cattle, maximum sentence was 10 years. But the maximum sentence for luring children was only 5 years. And my bill was going to double that, to at least make it equivalent to the rustling of cattle. So that bill was tabled, it was debated, it went to committee, came back, and eventually became the law of our country, and still today is the law of the country. Can an MP help shape the future of the country? Yes. Bill C-314, which was another bill I brought forward more recently, which was intended to protect the most vulnerable in our society against assisted suicide. As many of you know, assisted suicide, or MAID as it's known, that's the acronym. MAID was made available initially for only the sickest individuals who were facing a terminal condition that was providing intolerable pain. That was how narrow the original decision of the Supreme Court, which was then manifested in the legislation, was drafted. But no sooner was that bill passed in the House of Commons that the whole legislation came before a Quebec court, not the Supreme Court, Quebec court. And it said, well, you can't restrict this expansion of MAID. You should allow it for those who are not necessarily on the cusp of death, but have an intolerable pain with an incurable condition. And rather than letting that go to the Supreme Court, which might have said, no, we have outlined how narrow MAID should be, the government introduced legislation which would actually implement that. And on top of that, they said, and we believe that those who are suffering from mental illness, including depression, should be entitled to avail themselves of this remedy. I felt that was far beyond what was merited in terms of medical assistance in dying. So I brought forward Bill 314, which would have eliminated the mentally ill from the expanse of that legislation. It was debated in the House of Commons, and there was cross-party support for this, but not enough, because the Prime Minister had said to his caucus, I don't want you to vote in favor of Mr. Fast's bill, but tell you what I'll do. If you don't vote in favor of it, I'll send this back to committee, and the committee can determine whether Canada is ready for the expansion of MAID to the mentally ill. And that's what happened. My bill actually failed, although it's been taken up by another MP in this current Parliament, a gal by the name of Tamara Jansen, who's moving this bill through the process. And the issue did go back to committee, and the committee unanimously recommended that Canada was not ready to expand MAID to the mentally ill. But I believe the government is pretty well set on implementing that anyways. It was a 3-year delay that they agreed on. But can someone like a Christ follower like me make a difference? I believe we can. We've been able to push back on MAID. And of course, I had the opportunity of serving as Canada's international trade minister, was able to negotiate trade agreements all around the world, which now, when we see what's happening to the South with all the tariffs being imposed on Canada, seems to be prescient in terms of the kind of support that Canadian companies need going forward, shaping the future of our country. Oh, I should mention, Motion 111. I introduced a motion in the House of Commons, which was passed, which created Mennonite Heritage Week, the second week of September. How many of you knew that? It is now official policy of the Government of Canada that we recognize Mennonite Heritage Week every second week in September going forward. Let me speak a little bit about the gift of mentorship. Perhaps the greatest responsibility we have, certainly those in my age bracket. I'm now 70, and I get to mentor my grandchildren, all 15 of them. And, that's quite a task, because the challenges from the world are significant. And helping mold the character of our grandchildren, the next generations to come, and instilling them a sense of commitment to lead, not necessarily politically, but leadership, and what it means to be a servant leader and the character it takes to be a servant leader. And that is perhaps our greatest responsibility. Having mentored many dozens of young aspiring leaders over my 20 years in Ottawa, some of those are now members of Parliament. One is now the Labour Minister in Ontario, and many have gone into law. They've gone into the charitable sector, serving the underprivileged and the vulnerable in our communities. My father, I mentioned my father sitting me down. He recognized that moment in my own life, and to him I will always be grateful for planting a seed of interest and inspiring me to take up the career that God would eventually call me to pursue. We must prepare a new generation of leaders who are grounded in character, that are resilient under pressure, and committed to both truth and grace. Politics will always be messy. It has been throughout history, but it need not be corrosive. By building bridges of trust and modeling integrity and refusing to bow to cynicism, Christians can offer a vision of public life that is both faithful and constructive. So let me close. I'm probably closing a little bit early, which leaves more time for questions. And that would be a call for us to reason together. Because faith and politics will always exist in tension. We can't escape that. But we are called not to win every political battle, but to remain faithful to God, to our conscience, and to the people we serve. As Wilberforce and Luther and Bonhoeffer and so many others demonstrated in their own eras, faithfulness and courage can indeed change the course of history and serve the greater common good as we do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly. So in a time when public discourse has become coarse and polarized and our culture feels adrift, the words of Isaiah ring ever true. Come, let us reason together. May we as Christians and as a Mennonite Brethren community of faith continue to engage boldly, yet humbly, confident that the battle is the Lord's and that our role is to bear witness to the gospel of Jesus, not only in church pews, but also in the public square. May God bless you as you continue to serve.
So I'm going to ask a couple of people just to help me with the microphones here. Somebody over on this side. So if somebody has a question, would somebody just help me here? Yeah. And if people raise their hands with a question. Yeah, and if you can go kind of down that aisle. So I'll just open up for questions. They're already coming. First of all, thanks, Ed, for sharing that with us. And there's a number of people that already have their hands up. Go ahead. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm not sure if they turned them on. Where's the sound guy? Yeah, you'll try to get him. We'll just wait a sec because it's good for people to be able to hear the question.
Actually, if you want to ask your question up front here, I'll be able to hear it, and then I'll...
This mic isn't on either.
Yeah.
Check.
That one's going. Good.
Sir, my name's Kevin. I serve as a pastor in the Niagara region. Thank you for your service to our society. And I resonate so much with so much of what you said. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more on the challenge of partisan politics. You know, as I think about local politics and kind of being free from that allegiance to a larger team, if you will, I guess I see the challenge of being of the call of a political party towards allegiance. And did you ever have a sense where you're called to toe the party line, and it felt like your allegiance to Jesus and your allegiance to that party were in tension?
Yes. And that happens relatively regularly. Understanding that, again, as I mentioned, politics is a team sport. Your team is the party that you belong to. Now, some have said, well, why don't you run as an independent? How many independents are there in the House of Commons today? 0. And there are those who will become independents because they disagree with the party's policy after they've been elected, and they typically don't get re-elected. So the reality is that the debates you have on policy take place behind closed doors within caucus meetings. And I can tell you, having been in caucus meetings for many, many years, some of those caucus meetings can get pretty raucous because of differences on policy. But it's like a football team, right? You've got a coach, you've got a quarterback. Who calls the plays? It's going to be the coach and the quarterback. And if you're off running a different play than the rest of the players are, you're not going to be on that team for long. So it's an analogy that I think is appropriate for this context, but it represents significant challenges for those of us that are Christians and want to live out a life of servant leadership within that context. Now, there are times, and I'll explain a situation, like you often will disagree with the positions that the leadership of your party has doubled down on. It will happen. And you have to simply accept the fact that if this isn't a matter of conscience, it's a matter of public policy. We're always going to have disagreements on public policy. And sometimes it's just the degrees to which public policies will be, more extreme or less extreme or more assertive. So these discussions on policies, I think it's fair to be able to come out of a caucus meeting and then play as a team, and you vote as a team. But it's very different for matters of conscience. And I remember recently on a matter of conscience where it was pretty clear the leadership of my party wanted us to go in a certain direction. And there were a number of us saying, you understand this is a problem. We demand a free vote because most parties, actually all of the parties except one, being the Conservative Party, will not allow free votes on matters of conscience. The Conservative Party, on paper at least, as a policy matter, will allow votes on conscience to be free, which means we're all freed up. But occasionally the leadership will say, well, it's a vote of conscience, but I feel so strongly about this, I really want you to vote this way. And when you're in conflict there, you have a choice to make. You either play with the team or you become independent because you'll be kicked out. The other option is to go to the leader and say, you understand this is a matter of conscience and you're breaching our own party's policy on matters of conscience. And in this case, the leadership team acknowledged, yes, this is a matter of conscience, and they eventually allowed a free vote. Now, many of my colleagues voted with the leader. I didn't. The second issue is, what if it's a policy matter that you profoundly disagree with? I had a situation where, actually, originally when I was trade minister, we negotiated a free trade agreement with Ukraine. And we completed that. It was implemented. When we left government, and the new government came in a couple of years after that, they realized there's some tweaks we want to make to that. We want to modernize that agreement. So they went back and renegotiated with Ukraine, and that agreement came back for ratification within the House of Commons. And I found out that the party position would be to vote against it. I, being the former trade minister, was going to vote against a trade agreement with one of the most vulnerable countries in the world, being Ukraine. I felt I just could not do that, especially since the pretext for voting against it was, well, there is some language there that anticipates parties will cooperate on carbon pricing, carbon taxes, which sort of went against the narrative, prevailing narrative within our party. But it wasn't actually a substantive element that imposed carbon taxes on anybody. And I made the case that, you know what? Let's support this and make a commitment that we get into office, we'll modify that language so that it complies with what our party position is. And ironically, carbon taxes have now been eliminated, right, in Canada by the new government. I went to the leader and I said, listen, I just can't vote against this free trade agreement. Now I was told, well, you know what? You know, our expectation is, you know, this is a team game and you're voting in favor of this. I said, especially the pretext upon which it's being done, we're not imposing a carbon tax on Ukraine. Everybody knows that has read the language. And so finally, we came to an accommodation. And this is what happens within politics. They suggested that, would you at least abstain from voting? And I said, you know what? I'm a team player. I cannot stomach the idea of voting against Ukraine on this, especially since substantively, this agreement is actually in favor of Ukraine. And so I did. I abstained, and I stayed within the caucus. So there are accommodations that can be made, but, you know, sometimes you're faced with this decision. You know, it's my conscience or it's the party.
Okay, thank you.
I think we have a question over here.
Go up front here. Oh, right here, yeah.
Bonjour, mon nom est Réal Bonneville, je suis du Québec. Je parle français, mais aussi un peu anglais. My question is kind of close to the one before. Is like in Canada, we are talking a lot about the military increase of spending. We were like at 1.something%, and now we want to go to 5%. And each province, they wanted their share of the budget for that. And like as a politician, you represent British Columbia, or you represent Quebec, and how you do to be faithful to your mandate is your province, and faithful to God, to Shalom, that say, don't go to war, because arm are for war is not only for defense, and how you deal with all of that.
That's a good question. I expected that question to come, given the theme of the conference. But I will say this. I think before we even get into that discussion, we have to determine whether nations have a right to arm themselves for protective purposes. I am not in favor of, obviously, of countries taking an expansionist view of their long-term goals, the way, say, China and Russia have done, and maybe even Donald Trump, right? You know, he wants to take over Canada, wants to take over Greenland. I don't believe that is warranted in any way. In fact, it conflicts with the way of peace, shalom. Having said that, I don't have a problem with nations providing for their own protection, and that requires the purchase and the manufacture of arms to do that, especially within a world like ours, where the technology is constantly evolving. I don't have a problem with doing that. To get to your question about how much Canada spends, we presently spend about 1.37% of our GDP on defense. Donald Trump has suggested we have to go, originally he said, you're not living up to your 2% commitment, and we're not. Canada's not even doing what it committed to do. Secondly, they want us to go to 5%, as you said. There's some suggestions it might be 3.5%, but we're talking about tens of billions of dollars of extra spending on military. Canada may not be given an option here because, as you know, we are renegotiating. We're just starting to renegotiate the trade agreement between our country, with US, Canada, and Mexico. And in that negotiation, I believe it's going to be a very ugly negotiation where the US comes with a whole bunch of demands. One of them will be continental security and the fact that Canada has not done its part and needs to come up to 5% or 3.5%. I expect that it's going to be a very live issue in these negotiations, and that Canada will be expected at the end of the day to invest heavily in rearming, because our military has been degraded over the years, and even going beyond that, maybe joining the Golden Dome, the ballistic missile defense system that the US has been floating for many years and which is still live, the Golden Dome. It presents us as decision makers with very difficult decisions. Do we support, the expansion of our military capabilities? And then the question is that justified within the context of a nation-to-nation relationship and our ability to help defend the West against military threats from Russia, from China, from elsewhere? It's a tough one. I don't have an easy answer to it. I have voted in the House of Commons to support our military, to support our men and women in uniform, because over the years, the preparedness of our armed forces has declined dramatically. So we either do it right or we don't do it at all. And we may have a discussion here, hey, maybe we shouldn't do it. But anyways, that's my answer to your question, as obtuse as it might sound.
Yeah. There was a question right here, too.
Yes, my name is Zachary, also from Quebec, so you'll think that the audience is from Quebec.
Into the microphone a little bit more.
Okay, sorry. I'm from Quebec. I usually vote for the Bloc, and I work for MCC, so cards on the table. Quick question for you. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for not thinking yourself so pure as not to get into politics. I appreciate your involvement. Although I've never voted for Conservative. My question is, maybe if you present in Quebec, I would. Now, my question is, do you think you could have got involved with the current Conservative Party? And what is the difference between then, Harper years, and this Conservative Party now?
That's a political question. Are we talking about shalom or are we talking about... All right, I'll try to answer that. I'm 70, so I retired because I've got 15 grandkids and I want to help shape their character. And you only have so much time to do that, right? But I will tell you, I've become somewhat disillusioned with the state of my party, which I still support, by the way. Ideologically, I'm a rooted conservative. We can have a discussion offline of why that is. I believe there are compelling reasons for us as people of faith to at least understand why a lot of Christians are conservative. But within the party as it is, it's one thing to be a conservative from a worldview standpoint. It's quite another to be a member of a conservative party, which is driven by pragmatism, makes decisions that you might not like. I served under Stephen Harper. I have the highest of regard for him. He served in a way that I believe brought honor, dignity to the office of the Prime Minister. He was not flashy. He was not warm and fuzzy. People say, well, he comes across as a little mean. You know what? He's an introvert. Everybody knows Stephen Harper is an introvert, but eminently capable in the areas that he was tasked to govern. He was an economist. He knew what he was doing, steered us through the 2008, 2009 economic crisis, the global economic crisis. We came out the other end. By the time we left office, guess what? We returned to balanced budgets, which are now a distant memory in Canada. So I served under a prime minister that was consequential, trustworthy, not perfect, but someone that I could truly respect. Since that time, of course, we had a government under Justin Trudeau. I won't comment on those 10 years, but our party has changed. It's become more, I would say, populist. It's become somewhat more polarizing. And I'm encouraging the party to understand who we are, because the roots of the modern Conservative Party are the Reform Party, the Alliance, Canadian Alliance, which were grassroots parties, where it was the grassroots that informed party policy and from whom candidates were chosen. Today that's been turned on its head, including in Abbotsford, by the way, where the most qualified candidate was disqualified because that wasn't the choice of the party leaders, and they basically ensured the nomination of someone who was arguably the most unqualified individual. So the whole notion of grassroots and responding to that has waned within our party. So I'm doing my best to try to push back on that and say, you know what, we're in a much better space when the people have their say, rather than this being dictated from above.
Okay, we have a question over here, and then we'll go over there.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Fast, for your presentation, for your honesty. I must say personally, I am quite disturbed at the pro-military direction that the way you're speaking of supporting the military. And I think as Christians we need to imagine and work towards a country without a military. But we don't even dare to imagine the possibilities of that. But that isn't my question, although you can comment about it. I remember reading when you were the trade minister of Canada's, to date at the time, now correct me if I'm wrong, I may have this wrong, but the largest military deal, export deal, signed by you with Saudi Arabia as trade minister for what were termed personnel carriers, I believe, which can easily become armored personnel carriers. There was a lot of discussion that we are sending military equipment to a country that has a very poor human rights record, if at all. And on that basis alone, that deal should probably never have happened. But I understand it did, and perhaps even to date, Canada is still sending those vehicles to Saudi Arabia. Maybe it's ended, I don't know. But I wonder, in retrospect, how do you feel about signing that kind of a deal? I think your signature was the initial one, and no doubt, I don't know the whole process, but, and I may have made some mistakes here. I'm open to correction. Thank you.
Thank you for the question and the spirit in which it was delivered. Thank you. You're talking about the GDLS deal, which, yes, it was armored personnel carriers, arguably the best ones in the world. Remember, that was a transaction between a private company in Canada, GDLS, and the government of Saudi Arabia. The federal government's role is through something called the Canadian Commercial Corporation, which is the government-to-government procurement tool that helps Canadian companies, whether it's military hardware or something else, to engage with countries elsewhere around the world. It basically provides assurance to the Canadian company that they will actually deliver whatever products they've agreed to sell. In retrospect, if I had to do the deal again and I knew where this would take Saudi Arabia, I would probably say no to the deal. You make decisions based on what you see on the ground. At the time, Saudi Arabia was, there was no indication at that time that they would be using those personnel carriers for aggressive military action. In fact, they did. And in some cases, they use these against their own people. And so, yeah, upon reflection, I would say maybe not the best transaction for the government to facilitate, which is what the government does. It facilitates it through insurance and assurances to the purchasing foreign government. But I hope that addresses your question. I still do believe that nations are entitled to arm themselves sufficiently to defend themselves against hostile actions from other countries. I do not believe that a nation's role is to expand its territory. That, to me, is far beyond the scope of what a country should have as its mission and a vision for its people.
Okay, we have another question over here. Yep.
Hi, my name's Jeff Martins from pastor at a church in Ontario. One of the things I've wrestled with thinking about Christians engaging in politics, particularly at a federal level, is the oath requirement that I believe MPs have to make. And kind of maybe more than the specific oath, but like kind of the frame of mind where you kind of have to be thinking that you're acting on the best, like on behalf of the nation state. And it's particularly as you engage internationally, like having that mind where you're kind of identifying as like you know, always thinking in the best interest of Canada as a nation state as opposed to like thinking about humanity. I don't know if that makes sense, but I just feel like it gets, in my own thinking, it's become challenging to as a Christian to kind of have that mindset as a representative of the nation state. So anyways, I don't know if that makes entirely sense, but I just wondered if you've thought about that piece as opposed in regards to the oath and thinking in terms of nation state way of dividing the world.
Sorry, just for clarification, did you say the oath to Carney, as in Prime Minister Carney?
No, the oath, it's my understanding that in order to serve in Parliament, you have to take an oath to the King. Okay, yeah, not Carney, no.
By the way, I wish we should be swearing allegiance. Check.
It's coming in and fading.
Yeah.
Might be the bad
I don't think we should be swearing an oath to a foreign monarch anymore, not in a modern democracy like ours. But that said, to get to the nub of your question, I understand your concern. Our country has the ability to actually do what I think you would prefer us to do, which is to represent a value system to the world that actually has the ability to improve outcomes all around the world. Canada at one time had a stellar reputation for doing that, all around the world. Even under Harper, when you think of the maternal and child health initiative that we came up with, which promoted maternal and child health all around the world in some of the most ghastly places where health outcomes are so terrible. Canada had an opportunity to do something really meaningful there. And by the way, our policy did not promote abortion in those countries. Today, of course, Canada promotes these alternative health remedies as a way of addressing some of these challenges in foreign countries. I find that to be disturbing. I believe we should have a policy that respects other nations and where they're coming from. But we have the ability to make a difference. Let me give you an example. And a lot of people don't understand this. It used to be, I'm not sure it's the case anymore, when we used to go around negotiating with countries around the world, some of the countries were very poor, had no skill set when it comes to negotiating trade and investment treaties, advanced taxation agreements, air transport agreements. They don't have the negotiating capacity to do this right. So what would they do? We would be at some international event, let's say APEC or the OECD or the WTO. They'd come up and approach us and say, listen, Minister Faster, would you please, could you give us the names of a few people we could talk to within your trade team that could help us as we're negotiating with the United States? Because we feel really vulnerable here. You know what, Canada? We would do that. I would task a number of individuals to meet with them, and they would share our best practices when it comes to negotiating with a large partner like the United States. Canada had the ability to do that. We had the reputation for it because we were trusted. And I would suggest to you that over the last, say, decade or so, we've lost some of that currency around the world, and it's our challenge to regain that. I'm hoping that the new government in Ottawa understands what's happened over the last decade and will reestablish these bridges of relationships with countries like India and like China and like the Philippines and like Italy, where we've burnt our bridges too often.
Maybe I could just follow that
Walter,
up. He asked about the oath.
Yes.
Could you say something about that, the oath of allegiance to the country as a politician? Are there limits to the allegiance? What is the level of allegiance that you are called upon with your oath to render to Caesar, to Canada in this case? Does that give you wiggle room as a Christian to put your allegiance to Christ's kingdom above that when it conflicts, for example, with your conscience?
Well, if you actually see the oath, it's a fairly benign oath. The issue has been, especially for Bloc members, they don't want to swear an oath to the king. And it rankles them that they have to do that in order to take their seat in the House of Commons. Now, the Bloc came forward with a bill which, I'm trying to remember, but I believe it passed, that allows them some alternative wording. What they had been proposing, something along the lines that you're swearing an oath to the people, to the country, to the people of Canada. But it's a benign oath that, in my mind, doesn't in any way conflict with my greater allegiance to God at all.
Yeah, thank you. There was one last question that we'll take. It is 11:27. We're getting close to 11:30. Was there one over here?
I got three over here.
You got three. Can you keep them really short, and we'll have short answers if possible?
Andre, you got a short question?
I don't know if it's short. My name is Andrei. I'm from Ukrainian Bible Church from Abbotsford. It's a pleasure to meet with you. And I just wondering the distance between churches and politics. And is it a place where churches need to work wider or deeper to influence so that Christian values would be more influence on the political decision that is making? What do you say about this?
I think there are two pieces to that. should our churches be active in promoting specific political parties or ideologies? And I would say, please, no. Let's not go down the American experience. I don't want to see that happening. I don't believe that's the role of churches. Do churches have a role in encouraging their members to participate in this gift that I talked about, which is democracy? I believe there's a role. If a pastor chose to speak about civic engagement and what that might look like from a Christian perspective, without in any way, signaling I prefer this ideology or this party or that, I think that's a real opportunity for us to inspire and provoke our church members to take seriously the fact, yes, we are firstly members of God's kingdom, but God has also placed us in another kingdom, a lesser kingdom, but it's one that He's given us an opportunity to engage in because we live in relative peace. We get the opportunity to choose our leaders, to engage in that process, and to do so with relatively few restrictions. We don't know how long that gift will still be available to us. So if a pastor chose to speak on that, on civic engagement writ large, I would say, sure, yes, I would embrace that. But not an approach where churches actually become politically partisan. I believe that would be toxic to what we do in terms of our Christ witness in the community.
So there was one more over here, and then we'll come back to the two. Can you really keep them short, the questions?
And answers.
And the answers as well.
Thank you. My name is Landwehr from Hamilton. I think serving in Canadian Parliament is not easy. I can say, for example, like when they pass a bill of C-16, I'm thinking how, if I am in Parliament as a Christian, what is my reaction and how may I stand to help in the Parliament as not compromising my faith? The Bill 16 is talking about gender or transgender. As me as a Christian and my belief, can you tell us more how me as a Christian can stand? Thank you.
I can't tell you, quite frankly, I'm unfamiliar with Bill C-16. I'm not in the current Parliament. I don't know if it's a federal bill or whether it's a provincial bill. I don't know. I think our focus shouldn't necessarily be on those who may be suffering from gender dysphoria. Our focus should be on ensuring that parents still have the ability to make decisions regarding their children's welfare within certain limits, because some parents just don't discharge their proper obligations as parents, and I understand that. But in terms of a loving parent that cares for their child, wants only the best for their child, at the end of the day, I still trust that parent to make the right decision for their particular child. And I would say as we deal with this issue, by the way, it's a provincial issue. I'm not sure it's that implicated at the federal level, but provincially, because the education curricula are determined by the provinces, this comes up pretty often as an issue. And I'm a firm believer that parents should have the ultimate right to choose for their children and to protect their children against the excesses and the overreach of government, which does happen, by the way, much too regularly.
Okay, two more here.
Yeah, hi, my name's Craig, pastor in Abbotsford. Thank you for representing us so well. You got partway to answering my question just a moment ago. As a pastor addressing my church, I'm looking for some advice from you. I have people in my church who watch Fox News all day. I have people in my church who believe the government is out to get us. I have people in my church who are naive to the realities of the spiritual war that's going on. I have people in my church who are just naive to what's going on in government, or unaware, I should say. What would you like to hear as a person sitting in the pew with your experience if a pastor were to talk about how we should think about politics, how we should order that or value that in our own lives?
Well, in a perfect world, what I would do is I would start by talking about conspiracies and the fact that the prophet Isaiah actually turned his mind to the fact that his people were also getting caught up in the whole fear factor that is implicit in conspiracy theories. I will say that in my experience during COVID, my biggest disappointment was the conflict that took place within churches over what was a health issue. And it was conflated into being a spiritual issue. And in many ways, I feel we failed. We dropped the ball on this, where we should have been united as churches and say, listen, we're going to have different views on vaccines and the different mandates and the approach of the government, but can we agree that we as a church will remain united? We won't be an example of division that the world can follow. So having experienced that in my own office, people coming in and asking me my positions on vaccines and how could you and how dare you, right? And I had lots of challenges on that. What I would suggest, I would love to hear pastors speak broadly about what is our obligation as Christ followers within a fallen world to love mercy, act justly, and pragmatically try to shape our society for the common good. And that involves some boldness on the part of our pastors to actually take on the issue of civic engagement, because the moment you do, someone's going to say, oh, you're getting into politics. Well, no, you're getting into the life of the church and the believer within the marketplace of ideas. And all of us are in there. One way or another, we face this every single day.
Okay, thank you. The final question here.
All right. Oh, well, thank you so much for sharing and speaking. I wish I would have brought my 16-year-old son to hear you. Last question then. I would love to hear you help us see the areas or the individuals, the characters of the Bible that have inspired you as a politician to engage. You mentioned Esther and Daniel and others. And then, so biblically, some folks that have helped you as you've read them and see how they got involved in the mess, and then even historically, guys like Wilberforce, just maybe speak to some of those that biblically and historically inspired you.
Okay, two things. One is the value that I cherish the most, that hopefully has guided who I am. And secondly, who's the individual that has inspired me. The value I would go back to is humility. I see so little humility within the political realm. And humility goes to the root of our character. In fact, when you go back to the original sin, pride, right? When I look around the world and some of the great leaders have been brought to their knees, invariably it is pride. And if I could communicate one thing to future leaders is, if you're going to go and want to serve as a servant leader within political arena, make sure you are humble and approach everything with the humility that God calls us to walk in. Secondly, who has inspired me the most? I mean, there's so many. I mean, my middle name is Daniel. I love Daniel because he was in such a hostile environment. These were leaders that, did not recognize his God, but they recognized the wisdom that came from his God. And the one that really inspired me when I was younger was William Wilberforce, because he was a politician, and he was best friends with the prime minister of the day, but was never brought into the prime minister's cabinet. Why? Because the issue that compelled him was slavery. And that issue was contentious within the society of the day. Nobody wanted to give up slavery. And he was saying, listen, My Christian faith compels me to say what you're doing is wrong. You're keeping people in chains of slavery like this. And he was eventually successful in having slavery abolished in his country and years later within the Commonwealth. And I really admire him for putting his integrity ahead of his political ambition. Lord William Wilberforce.
So it's better to be an advisor than a politician. That's what you're saying. Or a pastor.
How about both?
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Ed, for this time together. And if you have further questions, Ed will be here throughout this day. Won't be here tomorrow morning any longer. He'll be flying back to Abbotsford. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And lunch is in 5 minutes.